For the first time in American history, the top 1% has more wealth than the middle 60%.
CEOs of large corporations making 350 times more than the average worker in that company.
And it's acting like a black hole in society. It's sucking the wealth away from the middle class.
Seems like a recipe for social instability and ultimately for revolution.
That's right, from politicians to YouTubers, from the Pope to Nobel Prize winning economists, voices across the spectrum agree on one thing. Inequality is rising and it's very, very dangerous. But what if the evidence to back up those statements is actually far weaker than we previously thought? That would be strange, right? World-famous economists like Piketty, Stiglitz and Ha-Joon Chang have given us at least 4 extremely convincing reasons why inequality is not just unjust, it's bad for the economy as well. The first reason is because the rich don't spend as much as the poor, reducing demand in the economy, killing local businesses and therefore economic growth. Second, inequality causes crime, misery, drug overdoses and even suicides as people naturally get miserable seeing their neighbors do well as they struggle. Third, inequality makes it less easy for young, motivated kids to move up in the world as only rich parents still have the money to give their kids private tutoring, extracurriculars and ever-increasing college fees. And ultimately, fourth, increased inequality undermines our very democracies as the rich use their increasing wealth to capture the government to rig the game further in their favor. To me, honestly, a lot of these stories have always just made sense. When I lived in South Africa, often considered the most unequal country in the world, I was genuinely shocked about how unsafe it was and how living in an unequal society, seeing poverty every day, just feels way worse than in an equal one like the European countries that I was used to. And yes, I too am very worried about increased political polarization, especially in the UK and US, the Western countries that saw inequality increase the fastest. Yet, the goal of this channel is not to spread stories because they feel right. Our goal is to look for evidence. So if inequality is really bad for the economy, crime, social mobility and democracy, there should, after years of rising inequality in the US and UK, now be a lot of evidence. But after going through mountains of evidence, our conclusion is actually quite optimistic. Inequality is not as bad as we thought, for 2 reasons. The first is that maybe with the exception of the US, where the richest 0.1% of the rich are still getting richer, inequality in general stopped going up. That is, if we look at the most comprehensive data we have from anti-inequality researchers like Gabriel Zucman, after rising a lot, for sure between 1980 and 2010, income controlled by the top 1%, the very, very rich, and especially wealth controlled by the top 1% and also wealth controlled by the top 10% have all stopped rising. That is great news. On top of that, these 4 negative effects that we expected would happen to economies where inequality went up by a lot, like the US and to a lesser extent the UK, we can't really find them in the data. For example, we expected that nations like the US or the UK, where the top 1% of people got way richer in the last 40 years, had far lower economic growth than countries like Austria or the Netherlands, where inequality barely moved. However, as you can see, countries that got more equal, that is Austria, or where inequality did not change that much, like Belgium, the economy grew roughly as fast as countries that got way more unequal, like the UK and US. And as research by the author of this book, Professor Lane Kenworthy, has shown, the same effect holds for crime. For example, if we compare murders, which are the gold standard for comparing crime across countries, because they are almost always reported, we can see that actually countries that got more unequal, like the UK, saw a reduction in murders similar to Austria. Meanwhile, the US, which got the most unequal by far, paradoxically also saw the biggest reduction in murders. Okay, but then what about other forms of misery, like so-called deaths of despair caused by suicides, plus drug overdoses and alcohol-induced liver diseases? Yes, here we can see that Austria and Belgium did do a lot better than the UK and US. However, the countries in this graph, they're all over the place, meaning that while we can draw a line through them which shows a clear trend, statistically, this relationship is very weak indeed. Similarly, for life expectancy, it is now quite well known that the US is being left behind. But the effect seems to be pretty weak. This line is not going down very steeply. And if we take out the US, the line would be flat. So again, the evidence for a relationship between inequality and life expectancy is just very weak. Even if we look at happiness, which really surprised me since I personally really found living in extreme inequality very uncomfortable, sure, the line is trending down, but countries are again all over the place. People in relatively equal Switzerland are quite a bit less happy than they were in the 1980s, just like in the US. Okay, so no strong evidence for 2 out of the 4 negative effects. Surely increased inequality reduces social mobility as the rich spend more on elite private schools and costly extracurricular activities, and their children will then gain an advantage that is increasing. Ideally, we would also test this across countries, but sadly the data is just not there. Luckily, the best data comes from the United States, the country where inequality has increased the most. It allows us to ask 2 simple questions. 1, are rich children pulling further ahead of poor children in the US? And 2, are poor children today less likely to move up than in the past? On the first question, this graph shows a worrying trend. Since the 2000s, rich kids are increasingly outperforming poor children on tests. However, poor children still perform significantly better than they did in the 1960s and 1970s, when inequality was at its lowest. Moreover, most of the rise in inequality occurred during the 1980s and 1990s, a period when test scores for poorer students were still improving. So again, the evidence that for this theory is not super strong. On top of that, research produced by left-wing economists such as Getty and Emmanuel Saez suggests that intergenerational mobility in the United States has remained remarkably stable over time, even during decades when income inequality rose sharply. In other words, rich kids have it easier and poor kids have it tougher, but this was also true in the 1960s, and things don't seem to have changed that much after the rapid rise of inequality. Finally, even when it comes to democracy, we all know the story that the rich rigged the game in their favor in the US, where super PACs dominate the political system and politically very active bro-oligarchs like Elon Musk and Larry Ellison have taken over major social media platforms. But if the ultra-rich are doing this to rig the game further in their favor, they're not doing such a great job at it. That is, the 2 most mentioned ways that the rich are rigging the game is by 1, lowering taxes, and 2, by busting unions. But while it may look like they did a great job at this in the US, if we look at the official tax rate, we can see that the effective tax rate for the top 1% has actually remained remarkably stable. That is, while official tax rates were extremely high in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, the ultra-rich were probably dodging those on an epic scale. This could explain why countries that did not get much more unequal, like Japan and Norway, also reduced their top tax rates by a lot. It could also explain why countries with even more stable or modest levels of inequality, such as the Netherlands and Austria, went as far as abolishing their wealth taxes. Similarly, when it comes to the US, states that have become the most unequal by far,
surprisingly, are the most lefty of the American states. States like California and New York and Connecticut and Illinois, where state tax policy tends to be relatively flat or proportional rather than regressive. Most states have regressive tax policy here in the US.
California is perhaps the most striking example. Over the past decades, the share of income going to the 1% has skyrocketed there. However, since 1999, California has enacted a wide range of policies that many wealthy interests should have opposed, you think? These include paid sick leave, paid parental leave, a major expansion of Medicaid, a $15 minimum wage, universal free school breakfast and lunch, and significant increases in funding for K-12 education, financed in part by 2 tax increases on high-income households. Again, these are just not the type of policies that you would expect if the rich were rigging the game in their favor further. So then what about the destruction of US unions? Surely the rich have used their increased power to destroy unions, right? Well, union power did decrease in the US, that is true. But again, this seems to have been part of a global trend that also happened in more equal countries like New Zealand, Australia, and surprisingly, Austria. If we draw a line, we can see that, yeah, there's a weak trend, but given the countries are again all over the place, this is statistically not significant at all. Crucially though, all of this does not show us that money does not influence politics at all in the US. Of course it does. Billionaires spend millions of political donations and they're buying media platforms. Clearly they have a big influence. In fact, as Professor Kenworthy explains in his book over here, there is plenty of evidence showing that when the rich want something that the poor or middle classes do not want, they are more likely to get it. So yes, money buys the rich influence. But as California and billionaire paradises like Switzerland show us, not all rich people want ultra-low taxes or hardcore inequality. Or if they do want them, then potentially having more money to spend on politics just does not buy them more influence after some point. Which means that we have now gone through each of our 4 channels that on paper all make sense, but the evidence to back them up is weak at best. Combine this with the fact that inequality is no longer growing in much of the world, except when it comes to the top 0.1%, not the top 1%, the 0.1%, Elon Musk, in the US, it's clear for me to see that inequality is bad, but not as bad as we thought. That is great news. However, when we published our interview with Professor Kenworthy or my previous video on Gary's economics, making a somewhat similar point, well, let's just say that the comment section was pretty spicy. We were disingenuously focusing on income inequality rather than wealth inequality. We were cherry-picking the data. We were, of course, out-of-touch academics and bought and paid for by the rich. So, for the rest of this video, I want to respond to some of these comments. Starting with spicy comment number 1 by Samuel Richer. This is infuriating. It's a lucrative and cushy job pushing this sort of narrative. Which, just for clarification, was aimed at Professor Kenworthy, not our channel. And first of all, I want to say it makes sense that people are skeptical. It's well documented that big oil companies, for example, have funded anti-climate change research. So it's not hard to imagine that they would fund research that says inequality is not as bad as we thought. However, in this case, Kenworthy has a long history of advocating for the US to move closer to the social democratic model of the Nordic countries. Plus, if you read the book or watch our full interview, you will see that he's very nuanced, which anti-climate change groups really hardly ever are. Next, when it comes to us, it will be illegal to receive payments for a video such as this without disclosing it, clearly and transparently. So let me be clear, this video is sponsored by Bellroy, which seemed like a perfect fit because of the next spicy comment by a user named... Clearly a real user, not a segue to our sponsor section. Joeri, you are looking increasingly tired. Maybe you should go on vacation more? Take better care of yourself, the environment, and your friends. Well, I have to say, I completely agree, which is why I partnered with today's sponsor, Bellroy. As I've gotten older and honestly a bit run down by parenting duties, I've realized that taking care of yourself often just means reducing daily friction. Bellroy makes world-class travel essentials designed to do exactly that. For me, that's 2 items. This classic getaway bag and this leather passport cover. As you can see, I actually ruined my last passport, which was full of stamps and memories, just by carrying it loose in my pocket. Now, this cover keeps my tickets, currency and identity in one place. It's one less thing to stress about at 4 AM in an airport with a crying toddler. Plus, since my main suitcases are now 90% children's clothes and toys, having this versatile bag to toss in the car or carry on top of a suitcase is a lifesaver. It keeps my personal essentials, laptop, Steam Deck and headphones safely away from the diapers. But perhaps even more convenient, Bellroy's website has become one of my go-to gift sites for friends and family, ranging from slings, totes, luggage to wallets. All of their products, they're made from recycled materials, certified textiles, or some of the best quality leathers available. So if you're like me, you are sometimes urged to take better care of yourself or are looking for the perfect gift, go check out the link in the description or top comment below and benefit from an exclusive 10% discount today. Now, having cleared my head with some better organization, let's get back to spicy comment number 2 by James Kelly 827. In my opinion, the author focus on income inequality rather than wealth inequality is incomplete and disingenuous. Okay, yes, this is a comment we get a lot. I understand why people make it because wealth inequality looks quite a bit worse than income inequality, but focusing on income is actually far better for 2 reasons. First, income inequality data is more reliable for international comparisons because it comes from tax records, while wealth inequality is harder to measure and some countries use different methods to measure it. You can look at the World Inequality Database transparency scores to see that income inequality data are just usually of higher quality. Second, income and wealth inequality are still 2 sides of the same coin. Income builds wealth, and crucially, if your wealth does not earn income, it will disappear over time thanks to inflation. However, if you are still skeptical for this video, we replicated the analysis of Professor Kenworthy using wealth inequality indicators instead of income, and still found no relationship between wealth inequality and bad outcomes, such as low economic growth or lower life expectancy. This may also help address spicy comment 3 by Salaryman number 1. I'm getting a light cherry picker vibes here with good examples about how money influences politics more behind the scenes. A point that maybe didn't come across so well in the interview, but it's actually in this book. Still, I think cherry picking is always a valid concern, so here are 2 more interesting insights that would have made the main part of this video just way too long. Number 1, you may think that good economic growth in the US could actually be explained by the ultra-rich just earning so much. This may partially be true, but even if we look at income growth by just the poorest 10% of the population, US citizens did roughly as well as their European counterparts. Number 2, you may say that excluding the poorest countries, which are often highly unequal, was a big mistake, but as many of these poor economies are growing faster, it would not change the analysis here by much. For democracy though, we were really curious. Aren't most dictatorships highly unequal? To get a sense of this, we decided to extend Kenworthy's analysis and compare inequality of rich and poor countries to the Economist's Democracy Index. And as you can see here, it does appear that the most democratic countries are the most equal. But again, the relationship is just very weak. You have relatively equal countries where democracy is under threat, like Hungary, and you have very authoritarian countries like Pakistan, where inequality is middle of the road, and you have super unequal countries like those in Latin America, where democracy is not the best, but also not the worst, like Chile. But of course, if you feel like we missed something specific, let us know in the comments below, and I'm sure you will. But before doing that, let's review the final and, in my opinion, most important spicy comment number 4, of which there were actually a lot. So let's start with Charles Entertainment Cheese, who says, if all the graphs look so great, why can I barely afford working a full-time job? Or this comment by Okapi John 4351, of course, it's easy to write a book about how inequality is not a problem when you are not on the losing side of inequality. This gentleman, Prof. Kenworthy, needs to go outside and feel the real world of inequality. To me, these comments illustrate that life has been getting harder for many people, and it's a job of economists like me to find out why. But just to clarify, when economists collect data, they do essentially step outside. It's just that they do it on a massive, organized scale to see if the experience of people like these commenters are not just isolated examples, but part of a bigger trend. And just to be clear, inequality is still worse than it was 40 years ago. Just as I felt inequality in the streets of South Africa, of course viewers from the UK and US will feel this as well, and it's not great. On top of that, there are 4 really worrying economic trends that will surely impact many of you, but are not all caused by inequality. First, there's the housing crisis, which, given that there are not many empty houses outside of places like London and Toronto, is probably mostly caused by local people holding back the construction of enough houses where they are needed. Second, the cost of living crisis is still not completely solved after the last massive energy shock, and it's about to get worse thanks to this new energy war with Iran. Third, most rich country economies have grown much more slowly than they did before due to having caught up to the frontier and due to rapid aging, meaning that fewer and fewer people will actually work. This is also increasingly straining government budgets all over the world, or in simple terms, making taxes higher but government services worse. All of these forces put pressure on the economy, which means inequality is only one piece of a much bigger puzzle. And while I personally think that the current tax system is very unfair and that billionaires are not paying enough taxes because they're dodging them, I would not be too optimistic that if we could tax them properly, we would solve all of our economic issues. For example, if the US decided to tax Elon Musk at 100%, yes, 100%, they could pay for their military for roughly 1 year. One single year. Similarly, taxing all the UK billionaires would only cover the UK government deficit, not all spending, just what they borrow for about 1.5 years. So all UK billionaires gone and the UK government stopped borrowing for 1.5 years. So, in conclusion, inequality is not as big of a problem as we thought for two reasons. First, in most major economies, inequality stopped rising. And second, a lot of problems that we thought were mostly driven by increased inequality are happening both in highly unequal and less unequal countries, so they're probably caused by multiple other things. But crucially, all the graphs I've shown here are not proof that inequality is not to blame for some of the very real problems facing our economies today. The economy is complex. Multiple things are determining growth, crime, social mobility, and democracy. But to me, the lack of correlations and the fact that inequality stopped rising for the most part means that it is dropping down my list of concerns. While stuff like increasing global conflicts and the coming demographic crisis are moving up my list of concerns. But yeah, that is my take. What do you think? I'm sure that you will let me know in the comments below. And for those of you looking for a high quality, eco-friendly product like this bag or passport cover for yourself, a friend or family member, please go check out Bellroy's site via the link in the description, since our in-depth research can only be done if sponsors keep supporting us.